I'd like to tell you a story about race, a historical story. No amount of research into the biophysical or genetic features of individuals or groups will explain the social phenomenon of race. The position taken by many anthropologists, both biological and social, and increasingly many more scholars of the social sciences, is that race is not a real thing. Race is neither anthropological, biological, or theological truth. Race is a cultural and social construct. Nowhere in the 66 books of story that we call our sacred texts is the word race even mentioned. When 5 white policemen shot Amadou Diallo, a young unarmed African immigrant, 41 times in the doorway of his New York apartment in 1999, the officers' actions could not be explained by examining their genes or their biology. Nor can we explain employer preferences of white job applicants, or discrimination in housing, or any other of the social realities of racism by references to human biological differences. This does not mean, and don't hear me saying, that the existence of race as a social construct has no impact on the biology of human beings. On the contrary, we know a lot about the sometimes devastating effects of racism on the biology and behavior of individuals and of groups. Because of several hundred years of racism, during which both physical and psychological oppression have characterized the lives and environments of those people seen as members of non-white races, differences in health status and lifestyles among them have appeared and continue to impact all of us. Even in our recent outbreak of COVID-19, the Surgeon General came on to the TV screen and made statements about the large number of Black citizens who were becoming infected and many dying with COVID-19 as causes related to obesity, comorbidity factors like hypertension and heart disease. And all of those things are true. But what the Surgeon General failed to talk about is why these comorbidities are more prevalent in communities of color, or more prevalent in Black communities than they are in other places. I live in St. Louis. Even though I work for the United Church of Christ and our office is in Cleveland, I fly back and forth between the two. And in St. Louis, there is a street called Delmar Boulevard. Delmar Boulevard stands as a stark reminder of how deeply impactful racism has been in our region. Even when Michael Brown Jr. was killed and people would come from all over the nation asking to be taken and escorted to Ferguson, a phenomenon that I always found very strange. There's a Ferguson in every area of this country, but people would come and want to see Ferguson. I would not do such trauma tours unless we were able to spend the day going to other places in St. Louis that, in my opinion, told the story of how you end up with a Michael Brown lying in the street for 4.5 hours. So pronounced are the social, economic, and educational and physical differences in St. Louis that much of our story can be told just at Delmar Boulevard. Delmar Boulevard is a street that is also named the Delmar Divide. And literally across Delmar, on the north side, where predominantly Black, lower income people reside, and the south side of Delmar, which is the exact opposite of that, there is a 26-year lifespan difference between a white man who lives on the affluent south side of Del Mar and a Black man living on the economically depressed north side of Del Mar. There has been an entire study done about St. Louis and about Del Mar in particular and other areas like it, contained in a Washington University study called For the Sake of All. It is available on Google. Just Google For the Sake of All and you can read the entire study. But I'm not suggesting that this just happens in St. Louis. I'm going to be bold enough to suggest that there are lines of demarcation wherever you reside in the New York area. And oftentimes those lines are constructed on the false notion of race. In the middle of the 20th century, a new generation of historians began to take another look at the beginnings of the American experience. They spent decades exploring all of the original documents relating to the establishment of colonies in America. What these scholars discovered was that our 19th and 20th century ideas and beliefs about race did not exist in the 17th century. Race originated as a folk idea, an ideology about human differences. It was a social invention, not a product of science. Therefore, race should only be analyzed as a social cultural reality that exists in a realm independent of biological or genetic variations. Historians have documented when, and to a great extent, how race as an ideology came into our culture and our consciousness. This is the story that I want to share with you today. One of the first publications, and perhaps one of the greatest impacts, was a book by Edmund Morgan, entitled American Slavery, American Freedom. It is the detailed story of Virginia, the first successful colony. On its publication, it was hailed as a classic that has inspired numerous other historians. The establishment of Jamestown in Virginia by English colonists occurred over 400 years ago in 1607. From the beginning, Jamestown was a crude, rough, and turbulent community comprised mostly of young Englishmen who had come to seek their fortune with the intention of returning home. They planned to emulate the Spanish, to obtain wealth by conquering and enslaving indigenous people and forcing them to produce gold and silver. But the indigenous people of this land didn't take well to slavery. Many of them died of European diseases and others escaped to unknown territories. There also was the problem that there was no gold and silver immediately available. Settlers soon discovered a crop. Most of you know what that crop is: tobacco, whose trade would bring them great wealth. But growing and processing tobacco, my friends, is hard work. The greatest problem the colonists faced was a lack of labor. Many settlers could not or would not do this kind of work. And so within a decade, the colony began to import indentured servants, mostly from England. And it was this pattern of servitude that provided a model for what would later become known as slavery. Servants were bought and sold. They were ill-fed and ill-clothed and poorly housed. They were punished cruelly for petty crimes. Mortality was high. But the surplus of poor immigrants from England in the early 17th century, who had few choices, made this way of life possible. If they survived the period of servitude, which was usually 4 to 7 years in the New World, then they would be set free and allowed to acquire land and servants and to make fortunes for themselves. However, there were many degrees of servitude, and not all of the people who came here in that role survived. In 1619, the first Africans arrived. And there's been some debate about who they were or how they ended up here, but what we know is that they had Spanish or Portuguese names, and they were already familiar with European culture. In the US, it is widely and popularly believed that the colonists brought Africans to the New World as slaves from the beginning, and that Europeans were naturally prejudiced toward Africans because of their physical characteristics, specifically their darker skin. But historians now hold that true slavery did not exist in the early decades of this new move. Englishmen were unfamiliar with the institution as it came to be. They saw their society as a free one based on free labor, and they believed that English laws had terminated all forms of slavery centuries before their arrival here. But they were familiar with many forms of bond servitude. They saw that as unfree labor. And some men who purchased head rights to laborers treated them as though they were slaves for life. Masters were often brutal. They flogged and they beat their servants, but settlers were also callous and cruel toward one another. Servants were often called slaves, and the distinction between servitude and slavery became more of a blur. Consequently, the first Africans who arrived in Jamestown were not initially or uniformly perceived as slaves. They were assimilated into the colony as laborers under varying contracts, much like those of the Europeans who were brought over. Some Africans worked off their debt and indeed became freedmen. And a few Africans even obtained land and livestock and built houses and married and established themselves as well-to-do planters. Others became entrepreneurs and engaged in training and commercial activities and had business dealings just like their white counterparts. Free Black property owners had the capacity to be just as contemptuous of government and arrogant and insulting as their white counterparts at that time. In fact, numerous court records provide clear evidence that these 17th century Africans did not act much differently from others who were in their social class. Edmund Morgan wrote, "There is more than a little evidence that Virginians during these years were ready to think of Negroes as members or potential members of the community on the same terms as other men and to demand of them the same standards of behavior. Black and white men serving the same owner worked together, they ate together, they slept together, and they shared in escapades together, and oftentimes they shared in punishment together. It was common for servants and slaves to run away together. It was not uncommon for them to end up in relationships together. There was no stigma associated with what we later began to call intermarriage. Black male servants often married white women servants. Records from one county reveal that 1/4 of the children born to European servant women were mulattoes. By mid-century, the colony was in a crisis. A few men from among the earliest settlers had taken over most of the fertile land, and they established large plantations and grew tobacco to make huge fortunes. But the poorer servants who achieved their freedom found it difficult to acquire land because now land was being amassed by the few. The freed poor and servants, which now included Europeans, Africans, mulattoes, some indigenous, became unhappy with this arrangement, and especially with the corruption and the abuse of power on the part of the wealthy who ruled the colony. They threatened rebellions. They plundered their neighbors. They showed contempt for leadership, and they generated unrest throughout the settlement. In 1676, the most famous rebellion took place. Many of you may be familiar with the rebellion of Nathaniel Bacon. It was led by Nathaniel Bacon, the Bacon Revolt, and it was an uprising of thousands of poor workers who were the first major threat to social stability. The rebellion dissipated after the death of Bacon, but British commissioners realized the potential for uprising, and they sent people to suppress the uprising so that the population at large would not get the idea that rebellion was a formidable task. On one occasion, they faced a dissatisfied group of 400 Africans and 600 to 700 European laborers who were chiefly Irish. And they soon recognized the need for a strategy to prevent this from happening in the future and to ensure that there was a sufficient number of controlled laborers to help keep the plantations going. That decision that the rulers of the colony made during the last decades of the 17th century and the first quarter of the 18th century resulted in the establishment of racialized slavery. They began to pass a series of laws separating out Africans and their descendants, restricting their rights and mobility, and imposing a condition of permanent slavery on them. Africans were now being brought directly from Africa. They were different than the earlier Africans in that they were often called heathens, that is, not Christian, and unfamiliar with the European languages, the customs, and traditions. And the same religious rhetoric that allowed the early explorers of this land, when they encountered indigenous people, to then write for a religious document called the Doctrine of Discovery that stated that those who were not Christian did not have souls, and therefore the conquest of their land and their property and even their bodies would not be punished by God. That same kind of thought is the thought that accompanied the enslavement of Africans in this country. Some colony leaders began to argue that Africans had no rights under British laws, and therefore they could be subject to forced labor with impunity. After 1672, British ships entered the slave trade, and the number of people shipped across the Atlantic greatly increased. There were critical reasons for the preference of Africans. As early as the 1630s, planters had expressed a desire for African labor. Many of those reasons had to do with the fact that they were accustomed to discipline, and they were also known to work well cooperatively in large groups. They knew how to grow corn and tobacco and sugarcane and cotton in their native lands. And those crops were largely unknown to the Europeans who had come. Many Africans had knowledge of metalwork and carpentry and cattle keeping and brick making. Colonists soon realized that Africans were a key to the amassing of wealth. A good example is the history of the colony of Georgia. In the mid-18th century, this colony, founded by followers of John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, was founded with the objective of settling poor people from Europe. The founders and the organizers had an anti-slavery policy, and Georgia became the first non-slave holding colony. But the experiment failed. The settlers endured hunger and disease and death, and they soon petitioned the trustees to alter the policy and to allow slavery. They argued that they could not survive without this increased labor pool. And nearly 20 years after its founding, the act prohibiting slavery in Georgia was repealed, and Georgia began to prosper. In contrast to indigenous people, Africans also had natural immunities to old world diseases. European colonists recognized that Africans lived longer and were able to produce more than Europeans who had high mortality rates. Moreover, Africans were in a strange land with no powerful allies, and unlike the indigenous people, could not escape to familiar territories. Hold on one moment, because I'm getting too much background noise here. Africans were the most vulnerable of all the people in the Americas. Sources of English servants began to decline in the latter part of the 17th century as jobs became available at home, and the slave trade in Africa increased as internal warfare in Africa made more and more people available for enslavement. Leaders of the colonies, all large planters, had two objectives: to impose effective social controls over the population and to provide themselves with cheap and easily controlled workers. They readily perceived that they could use the differing physical characteristics of the population to divide them and to demarcate some for permanent enslavement. Historian Anthony Parent argues that a powerful planter class acting to further its own economic interests deliberately brought a new form of servitude, racial slavery, to Virginia over the period of 1690 to 1723. And in this period, hundreds of laws were passed restricting the rights of Africans and their descendants. By 1723, even free Blacks were prohibited from voting. Colonial leaders were also doing something else. They were laying the basis for the invention of race and racial identities. They began to homogenize all Europeans, regardless of ethnicity, status, or social class, into a new category. And this is important, friends, because when we talk about racism in this country, we often talk about it even in the most compassionate and courageous hearts. We often talk about racism in terms of what it cost people of color, what it costs non-white people. But there is a cost to racism that belongs to white people. And a part of telling this story and stories like it is so that we might begin to see that when we operate in oppressive systems such as racism, that we all pay too heavy of a price. What is the cost of whiteness? What is the cost to have one's diversity, one's cultural background, one's connections historically diminished to the color of one's skin? The first time the term white rather than Christian or their ethnic names appears in the public record is seen in a law passed in 1691 that prohibited the marriage of Europeans with Negroes, Indians, and mulattoes. A clearly separated category for Blacks as slaves allowed newly freed European servants opportunities to realize their ambition and to identify common interests with the wealthy and the powerful, but be made aware that identifying common interests does not mean that everyone progresses to that place of wealthy and powerful. And I want to make that very clear because these are the same types of stories and tactics that are being used to divide people today. Laws were passed offering material advantages and social privileges to poor whites. In this way, colony leaders consciously contrived a social control mechanism to prevent the unification not of Black people, not of white people, but of the working poor. Physical features became markers of racial and social status. The earliest rationale for racial slavery was not differences in physical features, but the identification of Africans as uncivilized. Uncivilized. In the late 1600s, after centuries of conflict and brutal warfare with the Irish, Queen Elizabeth had declared that the Irish were natural savages. Before that, indigenous people had been called natural savages. Such attitudes generated extreme hatred of these groups. In fact, oftentimes, other groups other than Blacks in this country came very close to having race imposed upon them as well. Native Americans, as I said before, became savages when they resisted English appropriation of their land. And now in the early 18th century, by reducing Africans to permanent slavery, prohibiting owners from freeing slaves, prohibiting education and training, the English were inventing a new savage. From the early 18th century on, negative characterizations of Africans formed part of the rationalization for enslavement. And these became the stereotypes of races and race differences that we inherited in our stories of the 19th and 20th century. What colony leaders were doing was simply establishing unequal groups and imposing social meaning on them. As they were creating the institutional and behavioral aspects of slavery, the colonists were simultaneously structuring ideological components of race. They exaggerated human difference and then even invented some that could not be sustained empirically, such as the belief that Negroes had Black brains and Black blood. I shared with you in my story earlier from going from one school to another that one of the first questions I was asked in fourth grade is, what color is your blood? These images, these narratives that shape what we think come from the stories that we've been told and the stories that have been created so that we might be divided for the purpose of amassing wealth. From the last decade of the 18th century on, the writings of learned men appeared to proclaim a natural inferiority of Blacks. In the 1860s, slavery ended, but race as a social status and a basis for human identity remained. Race ideology proclaimed the existence of separate, distinct, and exclusive groups that were made unequal by God or nature. African Americans were the most inferiorly classed and were at the bottom of this hierarchy. And some European whites, not all, were at the top. Each race was thought to have distinct physical and behavioral traits that were inherited in the blood and passed on to their children. Thus, we have continuing stereotypes of Blacks as lacking in intelligence, lazy, overly sexed, loud, irrational, musical, emotional, and superstitious. And we have watched these stereotypes be created to create a story that matches the needs of our time throughout history. When we were in the midst of enslavement, it was not unusual to see caricatures and cartoons of happy slaves tap dancing and grinning, as though anyone would be satisfied and happy to be oppressed and enslaved. As we moved towards the ending of slavery, those media images and those depictions became images of predator Black males, of oversexed Black women. And the fear that is generated by such images continues to haunt us today. There's another study that was done of large groups of people, mainly around professions. The lead researcher is a man by the name of, the last name is Goff, but you can also find it on the web, which is called The Essence of Innocence, The Essence of Innocence. And in this study, large groups of professional people, including law enforcement, are shown images and given data about Black children even. And the results of this study showed that most law enforcement officers, when they encounter a Black child over age 12, do not interpret, because of the narratives they've received, because of the stories they've heard, they do not interpret that child as a child. They see a Black 12-year-old child as an adult. They see Michael Brown Jr. as an adult. Yet they would see a white child who commits a crime the same age as Michael Brown Jr. at 18 as a child. The language is totally different. This is how you end up in Cleveland, Ohio, my other city, with the death of Tamir Rice in a playground, swinging on a swing with a toy gun, yes. But even if it had not been a toy gun, Cleveland is an open and carry state. And within seconds of law enforcement reaching the playground, he was dead. Not because those law enforcement officers, I believe, went out to kill a Black person, but because of the stories that they have embodied and enfleshed and embraced. Tamir Rice, even at 12 years old, was a threat. I ask you to consider, as you listen to me, what are some of the images you have received about non-white groups growing up? What are some of the stories you have been told, whether you've been told verbally or whether you've been told by silence? What are the stories you have received? And those stories aren't just received by white people. They're also received by people of different colors and different races. Finally, it is believed that this race differences could not be transcended or transformed. And in the 19th century, science, using techniques of measuring various aspects of the human body, sought to affirm the differences between Blacks and whites and to justify the retention of phenotypically based separate and exclusive groups. We've all read the stories and heard the messages, measuring people's brains and deciding based on the makeup of people's bodies that they are superior or inferior. We are still living with the trauma of this tragedy today. In the 20th and 21st century, race sciences turned to IQ tests, and the new measure of human differences became primarily intelligence. In the 21st century, race scientists persist in promoting these supposed inheritable characteristics of different races. This is the legacy about how North American colonists constructed human differences, establishing a hierarchy of races for social, economic, and political purposes. This is the background, the foundation of how the story that I told you happened to me as a high school senior is made possible. This is the story. This is the background that causes us to be suspicious of people, not based on our encounters with them, but based on the color of their skin. This is the story that allows some narratives, even in our media, to be escalated and elevated to promote and support images of violence among some while ignoring the images and violence among others. This is the reason that leadership at the top of our nation can see things like what happened in Charlottesville and interpret protesters against protesters totally differently. There is a passage in the Bible, in that sacred text of stories, that says, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free." Well, the truth, my friends, is that race is like a vise that constricts our spirit and it damages our psyches. And both white and non-whites have been scarred in our daily lives by the racial images to which we have all been conditioned. People of color have been stripped of their country, their names, and their culture through slavery for Black people and through silence for others. Indigenous people, indigenous not just in Native Americans, but also Hawaiians and the first people of Australia, have been robbed of their land and subjugated on the land of their birth. And even in the US today, many people of color who are not in the Black and white binary issue are left to try to force their own identity in front of everyone else. The disparities I suggest are not a function of race, for race is fabricated, but they are a function of racism. Pathology is not endemic to Black people or poor people, though the dominant culture has too often framed it as such. And the sin of racism has had deleterious effects on those who identify as white based on the color of their skin, by creating within them an internalized expectation of superiority that is non-existent and therefore unachievable. Racism is a sin, and there are many who consider it the original sin. I differ there. I believe that the original sin is human beings' desire to be God, to create God in what image they are in. But racism in America is a sin with a root system that acutely damages non-white people all over this world and cannot be contained in designated locations, nor can it coexist with other viable life-giving ways of being in the world. And so as I close with this story, I ask you, how has racism impacted your life? What have been some gains and what have been some losses? Knowing the truth about our history and our scriptures help to free us from the beliefs and attitudes about human differences that were so deeply embedded in our culture and in our narratives. So much of our foundational religious background is rooted in the stories we hear in church, in our Sunday school classes, in our Bible studies. Where are the people of color in your stories? Where are the images of color in your materials? Where is the representation of color in our stained glass windows? Where is that representation at our communion tables? We have inherited a legacy of enslavement without fully understanding the realities of the 17th century. And because we have accepted it as the way it has always been, then there are pieces of us who struggle that there can be a time when it is not the way that it will always be. But it hasn't always been this way. It's one of those stories that deserves to be rewritten. Modern historians have provided a corrective to such distorted history by restoring accurate accounts of events and their causes, especially the role of Africans in making this country. Knowing the broader context in which our ideas and our beliefs evolves gives us a better understanding, not just of who the other is, but of who we are as human beings. And most importantly, it forces us to confront the reality of racism, even when we wrestle with the fabrication of race itself. No one, my friends, is born hating. No one is born with a sense of superiority. No one is born deciding that God would dare divide God's self. to hate a part of creation and love another part of creation. These are all things we have done to ourselves. These are all things that we carry from the stories that we have been told, from the stories we have created out of incidents that we did not fully understand, for the assumptions that we have made because fear has been cultivated in getting to know the other. And this is the work that has been brought full frontal force in our faces at this moment in history. And I believe it is the work of the church to begin rewriting, not R-E-R-I-G-H-T-I-N-G, R-E-R-W-R-I-T-I-N-G, but rewriting R-I-G-H-T-I-N-G, some of the stories that we have been given. This is the work that doesn't happen no matter how many Confederate monuments we take down, doesn't matter how many protests we have. This work only happens in community with one another, with the courage to tell our stories and to have our stories challenged and to be changed in the truth of the story we will build together. Thank you. I see some additional books. You Have to Be Carefully Taught, the song from the South Pacific musical, indeed. How can we stop African Americans from demonizing each other using the Bible as a weapon? An absolutely wonderful question to suggest that racism is not internalized in the people upon whom it is placed would be a fallacy. We all suffer from the impact of racism, and we find ways to other one another. If it's not race, it's sexuality, it's economics, it's gender, it's culture, and increasingly it's becoming our faith. So none of us are immune. And we stop African Americans from doing that the same way that we stop everyone else from doing that. By beginning to tell our stories and listen to one another's stories and rewrite stories for the benefit for all of us.
Traci, I want to connect a little bit about what you had us do this morning, which is for each one of us to share a story, and then what you're talking about this afternoon. Mm-hmm. Because I feel like I found in myself, when I was about to share my story, a little of anxiety coming out. I think because as someone who's Asian American, having shared my story sometimes with folks, I'm also used to people saying, well, I'm sure that's not really what they meant. Mm-hmm. Oh, I'm sure, they had good intentions. They were just wondering. Or, oh, they were just giving you a compliment that you speak English really well. Mm-hmm. Right. And so I think you talk a little bit, or, this whole time about how stories have the power to really decolonize our thoughts, our assumptions, our whole beings in some senses. Yes. And the story that you've just shared was really rich, and there's a lot in there, right? And so I'm curious how we can do this with an open posture rather than one of defensiveness, whether it be the story that you just shared or hearing somebody else's story that kind of hits us in a way.
I love that question, Larissa. I tried to spend a little time, and perhaps it was a little too subtle, but I tried to spend a little time by making it clear that we are all victims, that we are all, we have all inherited these narratives that distort our lives and distort our experiences with other people. We've all learned stories that cause us to make assumptions about those that we do not know, right? And so it is vulnerable to share those stories And because of the high risk of being dismissed or being counted not having hurt enough, or all the ways that internalization plays out in us. But what I think is necessary is that we keep in mind that we have all been hurt. Whether we know it or not, we've been hurt by these stories. And if we can come at this effort from a place of making the whole better, rather than the charitable effort of saying, I'm going to do this so that you can feel better. If you're doing it for me instead of for yourself, it's not going to end well. I guess that's what I'm trying to say, right? But when you understand that your liberation is intricately tied to my liberation, that your progression is intricately tied to my progression, that you can't fully actualize who all you can be until I can do the same, then we hear differently. And we're not there for judgment. We're there to be impacted by the stories that we hear, not to tear them apart, not to question someone else's experience, which is why I said this morning, your story is your story, right? Someone put in the chat this morning, you can argue with my facts, but you can't argue with my story. It is my story. And you can accept it and be changed by it, or you can reject it, but you can't alter it.
Yeah, I loved how you said, even when a story is shared, it's still your story. That was really powerful to me. You know, there's a question I think connects to what you just shared. Someone asked, how do we begin to break down and challenge the notion of race as a physical or scientific concept and move towards talking about and raising awareness of the falsehoods upon which this was constructed from the very inception? And connected to that is this question about, is there a better word, or should we stop using the word race to talk about human beings?
You know, in my world of dreaming, I wish we would go back to times when we could talk about who we are and share. And even that is flawed because so many Blacks who were brought here enslaved, we don't know our history, right? We don't know the origins of our families or those kinds of things. But there's so many other ways we could identify with one another rather than placing so much emphasis on the color of our skin. It's just a color, folks. You know, it's just a color. In the church, I wish that we would start doing things like having services and having social or even charitable events with churches, even within our own body, that perhaps may be homogeneously white or homogeneously Black, and putting people together, not just for the purpose of having a worship service with lots of colors in it, but actually doing some work and getting to know one another, having dinner with one another, decentralizing the color of skin and making prominent the content of character. Jan has her hand up, Larissa. Do you see her?
I don't.
Jan Everett.
Go ahead, Jan.
Hi, I've unmuted myself. We're talking about our stories.
Mm-hmm.
And my story is that we are a product of our experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And I know in my heart that racism is wrong,
mm-hmm.
that God created us all, and we should love everyone because God created them. But I was raised in Philadelphia, and we're not talking the better areas of Philadelphia.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was a little girl in 3rd grade, I was walking home from school. And as I was around the corner from my house, a little Black boy pushed me into an alley and tried kissing me.
Mm-hmm.
He scared the bejeebers out of me. I mean, he was a little boy. I was, but he scared me. And I ran home and I told my parents, and the school got involved in all kinds of stuff. But that was one thing. And then when I was in my early 20s and pregnant with my first child, I worked in Center City, Philadelphia. And one day I had worked a little beyond 5 o'clock, and I went to this lower pathway to the subway to get the train to go home. And I was walking down this flight of stairs and there was nobody else around. It was about 5:15. The crowd was pretty much gone. And I was walking down the steps. I saw nobody else except a Black man started walking up the steps. Mm-hmm. And as he got across from me, he reached over and grabbed me in, shall I say, the most private part of my body. Mm. And I started yelling at him and cursing at him and asked him who did he think he was. And I scared him off by yelling. I yelled because at the bottom of the steps, there was a stand where there was a cop standing. And I figured at least someone would hear me if it got any further. Mm-hmm. I got down to the bottom of the steps. There was not a soul in sight, literally. The cop wasn't there. There was nobody it was completely, I'm sorry, my phone is ringing. It was completely, I was really, really shook. So here's 2 experiences that I grew up with. Mm-hmm. And I try working on, Marty, could you please get that? He's probably sleeping on the couch. Anyway, this is what has happened to me. Mm-hmm. And so as much as I know here what is the right thing to do, there is something.
Hey,
I see something on the news.
Class.
Hello.
I wanted to let you know, because it was you, I wanted to let you know that I'm here.
Excuse me. Can people please?
May I finish really quickly?
Jan, could you finish really quickly, please?
Yes, really fast, really fast.
And I just want to say
that although I know it's wrong, there are sometimes when I see something on the news and I get this reaction. Must have been. It's a gut instinct that I can't control, and it's because I'm a product of. But I try. I work at it. I try.
Before Traci responds, can I just ask that in the limited time we have, can you all either put your questions or put your comments in the chat so that Larissa can continue this process with Traci.
Oh, you're muted, Traci. There you go.
I appreciate what you're saying, Jan, and your courage for saying it in this arena. What I would say to that is this is my thought. Because of the stories that we have been told, and because of the images that we have embraced and enfleshed and embodied, then those instances that happen to you have a larger repercussion than just that person, right? So if you scan back over the years of your life, and I don't know how old you are, but if you scan back over the years of your life, I would be surprised if you don't have images that made you uncomfortable or stories that made you uncomfortable that happened with white men or happened with white women. But because of the stories we've been told about the other, what happens, one of the costs of racism, is that the other loses the ability to be an individual. And what happens to you from one person becomes indicative of every person. Do you understand what I'm saying? And so the rewriting, the rethinking about that has to be with the consciousness of that. a consciousness. It doesn't make what happened to you right. I make no excuses for that. I'm simply saying it does not speak for an entire body of people. And as a nurse, it's in your head. It's in your head that way, which means that we have to recondition ourselves. And it's possible because we don't do it with everyone. We don't do it with everyone, right? If you watch the media, very often, if there is someone who is non-white in the media who has committed some crime or some violence, and absolutely that happens, they're talked about in terms of the Black community versus the individualness of that person. I don't experience that in the same way when a white person commits a crime. This is the result of racism. And it is so deeply embedded in us that it becomes a gut reaction, Jan. And I'm asking you to become more conscious of that gut reaction. And I'm also asking you to balance those memories intentionally with memories of times when you've had encounters with people who were not white and they were not violent or negative encounters. This is the work. And it's not the work just around race. It's the work around all the places where we let difference divide us.
Traci, I want to shift us a little bit because earlier in your story, you had talked a lot about how bodies are used as a commodity and monetized. And we have a question here from somebody: could we start taking the race box off of our forms? Does that serve a good or a polarizing service? And that got me thinking about our own Presbyterian Church USA. We have an annual statistical report that congregations need to complete. And race is one of the things on that form. And it's problematic for a lot of different reasons. One or two people are defining the racial categories for their whole congregation. And it kind of goes into this big database. And so some folks have said, well, we shouldn't collect that. It's not really accurate anyway. But then the flip side of that is that we have a lot of new worshiping communities and fellowships that are very diverse. And so there's also folks in our denomination who will say, well, if we just counted those communities in our midst, then we would be more diverse than we are right now on paper, which I think is around 92% whites. And the challenge with that is that all of these new worshiping communities, church plants, fellowships, they have no voice or vote in our process in the denomination. And so it is really interesting to me to think about this tension, this initial question that this person had of taking the race box off of our forms. Does that serve as a good or polarizing service? And I'm assuming that means, maybe census data, maybe school forms.
So the question would be, Larissa, whether taking race off the forms takes racism out of the heart, right? Because race on the forms doesn't just serve to pat us on the back and categorize that we have a little bit of diversity, right? Race on the form also alarms and alerts us to the times when we are not living who we say we are. So I'm not an advocate of removing it, because in the absence of it, racism still exists. So in the United Church of Christ, I've been pushing beyond just putting race on the form, because in the United Church of Christ, it has often been a way of being able to pat ourselves on the back. We are still 89% white in general, but if you look at our leadership, you would say, wow, they are really making some moves there, right? So what I suggest that churches begin to look at, denominations begin to look at, is not just what are the variations of skin color that are represented by those racial allegations, but how are those showing up? Not just that they're showing up, but how are they showing up? I'm going to leave race and go to gender for a minute. We had huge celebrations because the United Church of Christ now has a majority of ordained women over ordained men, right? And that sounds really great on paper. The question is, where are those women serving? Right?
Same in the PCUSA.
You feel me? So you can have all of this diversity, but who's still leading? Mm-hmm. Who still has the senior churches? Who still has the larger congregations? Who's still making a sufficient salary to live just off their salary in this one job? And the race question keeps us honest until racism can be addressed. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, and I think it connects a little bit to this, a comment that was a little bit earlier in the chat. Someone said, I had this insight about the Breonna Taylor travesty. The language has been about denying justice to Breonna, but we've also denied the very concept of justice for those who killed her and for our society when we let them off the hook. And so I think that just that idea of what is real, what is alive and breathing in our systems, and how it's working, like you said, it doesn't just impact one person, it impacts us all when it happens like this. Yeah. There's a question here. Somebody asked, how do we engage our youth about the story of race and give them a voice?
In many cases, our youth are way ahead of us. They don't live in the world that many just looking at who's on my screen would be in my age range. They don't live in that world. And the biases and prejudice that they develop largely come from the narratives and the stories that we tell. And not just that we tell with our mouths, but that we tell with our silence, right? I used to hold hope that as generations died, kind of like the sacred text, right? You're in the wilderness and eventually everybody dies off, so now we can move on. Even though we move on to a violent conquest, but that's a whole different workshop. What I'm saying is, I used to think that racism would just die on its own because of new generations. But I was invited to preach in Charlottesville the night before the alt-right rally. I was invited by those who were planning peaceful protests to be the preacher, along with Cornel West, who was the preacher the next day, the actual day. That Friday night, when all the images that made the newspaper, et cetera, came out, I was the preacher in that church preaching that night and preaching a multi-faith service. And when that service was over, someone came up and whispered in my ear, don't do the benediction, keep singing. And I kept singing, leading congregational songs. About 15 minutes later, I look over and they're saying, keep singing. I'm like, I can't sing much longer. What is going on? And then they came up and said that the church was surrounded by white supremacists and it was not safe for us to leave. And so I did the benediction. And I said, I'm from Birmingham, Alabama. I am not afraid of the Klan. I'm just not. And they said, you can't go out the front door. You have to go out the back door because they didn't want us to be confronted. I said, I'm going out the front door. I don't go out back doors. And they said, Reverend Blackmon, please don't. And Cornel West was with me. Come on, sister, we're going through the front door. And then we opened the front door. And we saw all of these tiki torches. And it was different than Alabama. There were no pointed hoods. There were no white sheets. These were largely young white men in button downs and khakis who looked like my children's friends, who looked like people that I worked with at the hospital, who looked like people that I worked with in the church that I worship with. And I was afraid. And I was afraid because in that moment, I realized that racism will never die. Racism must be killed. Racism must be asphyxiated. And as long as we continue to tell these stories and not tell the truth about this country, we continue to produce generation after generation that are not born hating, but that are taught to hate the other because we refuse to do the work.
Mm-hmm.
The work has to be done.
I think too, and where you started, when we think about youth, sometimes it's still in a very kind of hierarchical way. I don't know any other way to say that, but like I'm 39 and I still get put in the box of being like a young person in the church. And I'm kind of like, are you kidding me? There's like tons of people behind me that have different ideas, see the world differently, can name and claim things in new and different ways. And so that idea of how do we hear one another's stories and not value them, but just hear them for what they are feels really important. There's Trina put in here in the chat, as a white pastor serving a diverse congregation with a strong immigrant history, many members are from West Africa. I've been surprised that our white members are more interested in conversations around race or racism than our members of color. We've started a book group to look at anti-racism books together, and it's all white women. I'm curious as to how to engage the whole congregation in telling our stories in hopes of building a stronger sense of community and knowing each other on a deeper level.
I appreciate that question. You may not like my answer, but because we're getting short on time, I'm just going to give you the answer without the sugar around it. Dismantling racism is the work of white people, point blank. And Black people of African descent and of American descent have been explaining and educating for far too long. And so I celebrate that you have groups who are willing to work on racism, who are made of the people who are necessary to end racism. I don't think that that necessarily means that the Black people in your congregation are not interested or do not care, but they are simply tired, tired of bearing the brunt of education. I had to do this work around my views about LGBTQ. I had to do this work because I didn't grow up in an environment where I was not taught that to love someone of the same gender was a sin. And I came to know that that was a lie because of stories and relationships with people that I built. And when I came to know the truth, I was so excited about the truth. I assumed that other people who were doing this work were in the same place that I was in. And every time I would have a question, I have friends, good friends, it's not a cliche, who are same gender loving people. And I would call a particular friend all the time and say, I just read this, did you know, blah, 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 blah. And one night I called him, his name is Rudy. I called one too many times. And he said to me, Traci, I love you and I am glad you are awake and aware and that you have come into truth. But I need to tell you that your need to know does not create in me a need to educate. Go get some books, read some stories, do your own research, and then come to me with the questions that are left. It was the greatest gift he could have given me. And I offer it to you. Don't worry when Black people don't sign up for your book clubs to talk about racism. It's because we don't need to read the book. It's because we don't need to have the conversation that way. But when there is need for us to engage, because the work is authentic and it's not voyeuristic, and it's not just to increase information, but it's to change congregations, they will show up. They'll be there. So start where you can start and don't worry about the rest. There was a question, I lost it, but there was a question about what do I suggest happens in 99% white churches to get them to address racism and to address the real issues of not really being in this conversation. I'm doing a terrible job transposing that because the questions pass me now and I don't navigate chat well. But we're dealing with the same thing in the United Church of Christ. And what I am suggesting is that those of us who have the power of the pulpit, and the pulpit is power, that we need to begin preaching and teaching sermons that call into question, what would Jesus do for real? That call into question the beloved community, that read text in ways that show a Jesus who reached outside of his comfort zone to make room for everyone, to interrogate text in a way that allows people to ask questions and become uncomfortable in congregations and in places where the vastness of who God is not represented. And let me be clear, having more people of color in your pews does not necessarily mean advanced knowledge of anti-racism. The only place that it matters how many colors are in a place is at Crayola. You will know that you're on the right path, not when the color in the pews changes, but when the culture of your worship changes to reflect the presence of everyone so that all are included, not just in the numbers, but in the ways that you worship.
I think that I was looking back at that question, Traci, and one of the things in there was the person writes, part of the privilege, of course, is that the unpleasant questions can be easily ignored because they're not our questions. Mm-hmm. And I think I would argue, as you've said so eloquently throughout this whole thing, which is that they are that congregation's questions too, mm-hmm. right? And that maybe a part of it is just the privilege of coming to worship and not having to think about that. And the privilege of that. Whereas for me, when I step into the pulpit where I am the only person of color in my congregation every given Sunday when I preach and everybody else is white, right? Mm-hmm. That I embody that space and reckon with that space every week in a different way, right? Every morning I wake up, I think, I don't have a choice to think about race today. It is a part of my experience, and somebody maybe coming up to me in the grocery store and telling me to go back home, right? Mm-hmm. When this is my home. Exactly. And so I think a part of it is really grappling with the idea of even taking up the privilege of choosing to say, maybe not this Sunday, maybe it's not the risk. And I get the riskiness that this conversation feels, but the importance of having it for this larger understanding of our body and community is so significant to me.
Amen. Mm-hmm. Eric asked the question, where would Jesus be physically on October 22nd? Who would he be with? What work would he be calling us to? I'm glad you asked, Eric. I guess we all have to ask Jesus for ourselves. But I think Jesus would be in the breach. I don't think in any way that Jesus would abandon one for the other, that there would be room for both, and that there would be principles that apply to us all. And that's in the breach. It saddens and breaks my heart that we have become a nation, not just politically divided, but a nation where you have to choose a side of faith, not just differences, but to talk about one another in language of evangelical and progressive with disdain for the other is just as problematic as race. And the truth is, I had to tell my congregation this many years ago when I came. I played this hide and go seek. I played this hide and go seek game with my congregation because I lacked the courage at the time to just take the flag out of the sanctuary. So I would get my intern to hide the flag and pretend that I didn't know what happened to it. And finally, I just said, God is not Christian. God is God. God is not political in terms of caring about Republican, Democrat. God is God. It's in the breach that I believe God stands.
Traci, I know you wanted to share with us kind of like what can we do from here? Where do we go? And there's a question that someone put, as leaders of the church, what should we be doing to lead the church in this time and place to follow Jesus where he is?
I think we have to read the books that are being written. I saw somebody put in the chat that you all have a bibliography. Books like the book by Ibram Kendi, Stamped from the Beginning, is a good place to start, and some of his later writings as well. Anything by Cone, Aubrey Hendricks, The Politics of Jesus, Miguel Torres. You know, there are all kinds of books out there that you can read that begin to educate you about the ways that we wrestle in these places. And then I believe, this is funny, I'm sure this isn't true of your denomination, so I'm going to say it's my denomination. But we require people to have seminary educations. Seminary is largely about deconstructing what we believe. I mean, they spent about 2.5 years deconstructing us. And then the last half a year, they say, okay, put it back together again and go pastor some folk, right? It's the most bizarre process. But it amazes me how we spend all of that time interrogating texts, deconstructing notions and stories that we've heard. And then we leave seminary and get assigned to pulpits, and we use the very same material that we went into seminary to deconstruct. And I'm not suggesting that you can inundate people with everything you learned in seminary. Seminary was traumatic for me. I had to go get a therapist when I found out that, you know, I won't even go there. I had to go get a therapist when all of my Sunday school came crashing down. But we cannot abandon the academic and intellectual work we have done to prepare to be the megaphones of the gospel and fall back into what is comfortable and not challenging.
We require seminary, Traci, a Bible content exam and 4 written exams. So
wow.
We love the examination proof. And that, you know, what you're saying makes me wonder. And, you know, when we think about educating, teaching in our congregations, it makes me wonder, what do we center first, right? What I remember in seminary is like, okay, we're going to learn from Calvin, we're going to learn from Barth, and then we'll learn from Cone, right? And all these other folks. And I think that starting place, or maybe now if we're already, you know, in our churches, that continuation where we decide who we decide we center in those stories to create a greater understanding of who we are as people of faith feels really important.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, I want to find out if you have any other sending words for us, and then we'll hand it off to Nancy and Lori.
Are you asking that of Traci?
Yes, sorry, I was.
And Lori. Oh.
No. You're sending words, Traci.
Yeah, do you have sending words for us, Traci? Sorry, I got distracted by the chat.
Yes, I was reading the chat and with great intention. And I want to acknowledge something that is in the chat that I think is very true. You know, we're sitting on Zoom and I can tell you what I believe in my heart, and that's what I'm doing. But I don't want to suggest that this is easy work. It is not. I don't want to suggest that I don't understand that leading a congregation, if you are a minister on this call, is hard work. And that there has to be a balance between the prophetic and the priestly. That we have to care for the congregation as well as challenge the congregation. But I also will not dismiss that it is our call to speak truth. And sometimes that truth is to power, and sometimes that truth is in power. And just the very small changes we can make, that allow members to have the ability to interrogate text, that bring in different readings of text, that bring in different voices in the preaching moment, the placement of books in your study, that let people know that you care more about than what you have right in front of you, will make a difference. What we pray for matters. And as we gain that trust and relationships with our congregations, don't allow it to be based on false notions that we know are not true. Hanging a Black Lives Matter banner may not be your first move. But questioning what does God say about Black lives may be. Challenging everything everyone says is not a good move. But creating space for courageous and compassionate conversation may be. I travel all over the nation for the United Church of Christ. And one thing that sticks with me in this political season before COVID, because we've been in this season a long time, I was at a church and I was speaking, and the man, one of the members, the parishioner, came and he said, I wasn't going to come because I've seen you on TV. I know what kind of things you talk about. And he said, but you made space for me. And I think ultimately that's what people want. They want to be heard and have space made for them. And he said to me about my beloved UCC, he said, this is the only place where it's more dangerous to come out as a Republican than to come out as gay. But it stuck with me because you know what? There are lots of Republican UCCs. And there has to be room for all of us. I'm not suggesting we're all gonna disagree, but I am suggesting we have to create space for change. It is 2:30. I think I'm over. Are we over 30 minutes?
I got 2:26, so we're doing fine. Okay. Lori, would you like to say a few things about our recording?
Certainly. So I know a number of people have asked whether or not we would be recording the session or how they could get access to it. We will be making the recording available for further discussion, actually. We'll be having a follow-up conversation to this discussion in about 2 weeks. And so the recording and the information will be out shortly so that if you missed a portion this morning, you'll be able to review and get caught up. And we thank you all for joining us for this conversation and look forward to further conversation with you.
And once it comes out, you can share it with people. You can share it with people in your congregations, your friends, your family, people who weren't able to be part of this time today. We really are delighted that you all were able to join us. I'm sorry that there wasn't more time for more conversation. Right now, it is always a challenge to figure out how much time we need versus how much Zoom time is too much Zoom time, and it's just time to go stop for a while. So I hope that you all feel that it was enough time, that you wanted more, but it was enough time. For those of you who are going to join us tomorrow, who are part of Synod Assembly, I want to point your attention to the fact that after the opening, the welcome and the commissioners approving the consent agenda, we're going right into worship, the major worship service of Synod Assembly. And within that worship service, Traci and Anita Wright, who is the Synod's chaplain, will be administering communion. So when you come at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, please make sure that you have your elements with you, because there will be no break in the worship service for people to get up and go get their elements. Traci, I want to thank you for today. I think you have given us a lot to chew on. I'm hoping that we all go away just kind of having this bubble up and continue in our own thinking and our own deepening on this subject. And don't be surprised if we invite you to come back at some point.
I would love that. I would love that.
And yeah.
Sorry, Jacinth here. I'd like to just say, for everyone who is coming on tomorrow, I look forward to seeing you. I'm your Synod moderator at 9:30 in the morning, sharp.
Well, it's actually, we open the Zoom room at 9:30. And we're going to have some music and a couple of things for you to read. But make sure if you're not at 9:30 sharp, you're there in your place, camera on, ready to go at 10 o'clock. And you will see Jacinth. So Traci, I know that it's been a day for you. And I hate to ask you to do one more thing, but I think all of us would really appreciate it if you would be willing to pray with us as we leave this afternoon.
Indeed, indeed. Growing up in Birmingham, Alabama, I didn't attend daycare. I went to my grandmother's house when my parents went to work. And there are many lessons I learned from my grandmother that I hold very dear. One of those that I hold most dear is her telling me, Traci, there are many things in life you must be, but the one thing you need never be is ungrateful. I am grateful for your invitation to be with you today. I'm grateful whenever anyone invites me to speak and to share and to be a part of community with them. Thank you for showing up, not once, but twice. And thank you for inviting me into this week of journey with you as you assemble. Let us pray. Holy One, we thank you for the gift of story. We thank you for the gift of sacred story. We thank you that this gift lives and dwells and is present at all times with each of us and with all of us. As we leave this virtual space, but never your presence, help us to hold those stories in such a way that we break them open for you until we gather again and we are changed. In Jesus' name I pray, amen. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you, Traci.
Thank you.
circumstance.
See you all tomorrow.
Bye.
Nancy, will we have the same link to get on or a different one?
No, Lori will be sending you the link.
I'm going to send it out right now. If for some reason you don't receive it in the next 20 minutes, please be in touch with me.
Commissioner
Lori, is that link also going to Presbyterian disseminations so that they can also send it out so that people can live stream as well?
That will be a separate email that will go out to Synod wide, to the newsletter list, letting people know that the event is going to be able to be streamed on Facebook.
Lovely, thank you. That's what I needed to know.
All right.
See you tomorrow.
Take care, everyone.
Bye, Lori.
Bye.
Bye.